Dr. Nathan Cross had perfected the art of professional avoidance aboard the Concordia. 5 months into humanity's first joint research mission with the Velastri Ascendancy, and he'd managed to minimize direct interaction with their delegation to the absolute minimum required by his position. It wasn't obvious to casual observers. He was polite when forced into meetings. He completed his documentation work flawlessly. He just never lingered in common areas when Velastri were present, never engaged in the informal conversations where humans and Velastri built genuine connections, never accepted invitations to cultural exchange dinners. Everyone else on the human delegation was thrilled to work alongside the species that saved Earth 50 years ago. The Velastri, with their elegant long ears expressing emotions and their advanced biotechnology, were living legends to humanity. Compassionate interveners who'd arrived when Earth's climate systems were collapsing and given humanity the knowledge to restore what they'd destroyed. Nathan understood that intellectually. As a xenohistorian studying first contact events, he knew the intervention had saved billions of human lives. He also couldn't be in the same room as Princess Liara Velthara without feeling shame so profound it made breathing difficult. Liara had noticed. Of course she'd noticed. She was brilliant, observant, and had spent months trying to understand why one human consistently avoided her people when everyone else embraced the partnership. She'd consulted other humans who were embarrassed by his standoffishness. She'd reviewed his credentials, impeccable, his psychological evaluations normal, but his pattern was clear and deliberate. Finally, during quiet shift when most of the crew was off duty, Liara cornered Nathan in the observation lounge. Not aggressively, but with determination of someone who'd reached their limit of polite avoidance. "Doctor Cross," she said, her long ears angled in expression he'd learned meant serious conversation incoming. "I need to understand why you avoid me, why you avoid all of my people. Everyone else has embraced this partnership. Why haven't you?" Nathan's first instinct was to deflect, to offer polite excuses about work focus or natural introversion. But something in Liara's expression, genuine hurt beneath diplomatic inquiry, stopped him. And he made a decision that would change everything. He told her the truth. "Because every time I look at you, every time I see your people's compassion and advanced knowledge and genuine desire to help younger species, I see the reflection of humanity's greatest failure, and I can't separate you from the shame of what we needed saving from." Liara's ears flattened completely, shock and confusion rendering her momentarily speechless. "I don't understand," Liara finally managed. "My people saved yours. We gave you knowledge to restore ecosystems, frameworks to resolve conflicts peacefully. We're taught the human intervention was our greatest success, proof that compassionate aid works. How is that your failure?" "That's exactly the problem," Nathan said, decades of suppressed emotion in his voice now. "You saved us. You had to save us. Because we were so arrogant, so short-sighted, so committed to profit and national interests over planetary survival that we drove ourselves to the brink of extinction." He turned to face her directly for the first time in months. "We knew, scientifically knew for generations, that we were destroying the only world we had, and we did it anyway. Chose quarterly profits over our children's futures. Chose political power over species survival. Chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths until it was almost too late." His voice broke slightly. "You arrived when Earth's climate systems were cascading, when resource wars had killed hundreds of millions, when we were maybe a decade from civilization collapse that would have killed billions. And you saved us not because we deserved it, but because you're so compassionate you couldn't watch an entire species commit suicide through stupidity and greed." "I'm a historian. I study the records from that period. I read the scientific warnings we ignored, the political debates where leaders chose power over survival, the corporate decisions that prioritized profit over breathable air. I see how many chances we had to fix things ourselves, and how consistently we chose not to." He met her eyes. So when I look at you, I don't see our saviors, I see our failure. Every velastri on this ship is a walking reminder that humanity couldn't handle basic planetary stewardship without outside intervention. That we needed to be rescued like children who played with matches and burned down their house. I'm sorry, he continued. That's not your burden. You saved us, and treating you coldly because I'm ashamed of what my species needed saving from. That's unfair and unprofessional. I'll do better. But Liara's response wasn't what he expected. Her ears angled in expression that might be recognition or revelation. You're not the first to feel this way, but you're the first human to tell me directly. She gestured for him to sit. And I think it's time someone told you the truth about what actually happened. The version we teach in schools is simplified. The reality is far less comfortable for my people to acknowledge. Nathan sat, something in her tone suggesting this would change everything he understood about the intervention. We knew about Earth long before your climate crisis reached catastrophic levels, Liara began. We'd been monitoring your development for over a century. We watched your industrial revolution, your scientific advancement, and your environmental destruction accelerate. Nathan felt something cold settling in his stomach. You knew. You saw us destroying ourselves and you waited. We waited, Liara confirmed, pain in her voice. Because velastri intervention philosophy says species must be allowed to make their own choices, including destructive ones. That intervening before a civilization reaches true crisis violates their developmental autonomy. There were velastri scientists screaming for intervention when your climate models first predicted catastrophic warming, Liara continued, her ears expressing what Nathan now recognized as shame. When your oceans started dying, when your resource wars began, they argued that waiting for true crisis was excuse for letting billions suffer preventable deaths. But our High Council, my father included, refused. They said humanity needed to feel the full consequences of their choices, or you'd never truly change. That intervention must come only when a species faces imminent extinction, when they're desperate enough to accept help without resentment. So you let it get worse, Nathan said quietly. Let hundreds of millions die. Let ecosystems collapse. Let us drive ourselves to the absolute edge. Yes, Liara admitted. We let it get much worse than it needed to be because our philosophy said intervention must come only at the brink, when you're desperate enough to change, rather than just accept aid and continue destructive patterns. She met his eyes. We saved humanity. That's true. But we also let hundreds of millions die who could have been saved if we'd intervened earlier. We watched your suffering increase because our philosophy demanded you reach the absolute brink. And then we taught our children that the human intervention was a success story, never acknowledging that our hesitation made your crisis far worse than necessary. The revelation hit Nathan like physical force. The velastri, compassionate velastri, deliberately waited while Earth burned because their philosophy said humans needed to suffer more. My entire career, Liara said, I've studied intervention philosophy. I know the arguments that convinced my father to wait. They genuinely believed premature intervention would harm humanity's long-term development. But I also know that hundreds of millions died while we debated optimal timing for compassionate aid. Her ears trembled with emotion. So when you say you feel shame looking at my people, I understand. Because I feel shame looking at yours. Shame that we had knowledge and capability to save so many more, but chose not to because our philosophy prioritized developmental purity over actual lives. You're saying if you'd acted sooner. Nathan's voice broke. Hundreds of millions might have lived, Liara confirmed. Ecosystems that collapsed irreversibly could have been preserved. Wars could have been prevented. But we waited because our philosophy said you needed to reach the absolute brink. And maybe we were right. Maybe earlier intervention would have failed. But maybe we were just rationalizing our hesitation, convincing ourselves that watching you suffer more was compassionate when it was really us avoiding difficult decisions. But she was crying now, her luminous markings pulsing with grief. I've avoided confronting individual humans about this because I didn't know how to admit that my people, my father, made choices that let yours suffer unnecessarily. But you deserve to know that your shame is mirrored by ours. The conversation extended through the night shift. Nathan shared records from the climate crisis, desperate pleas from scientists, political leaders choosing short-term gain, cascading failures that could have been prevented. Liara shared Velastri internal debates from that period, scientists arguing for immediate intervention, High Council insisting they must wait, the threshold defined as imminent species extinction rather than preventable mass death. I've spent my career studying first contact events, Nathan said. One pattern I keep seeing is that we simplify them, make them stories about heroes and villains when reality is usually much more complicated. The human intervention is taught as simple story. We were self-destructive, you were compassionate, you saved us. But that erases all the uncomfortable questions about timing and philosophy and cost of hesitation. It also erases human agency, Liara added. We're taught we saved humanity, which implies you were helpless victims. But humans saved themselves too. Scientists who kept researching, activists who fought political indifference, communities that survived despite governments failing them. We provided tools, but humans did the actual work of restoration. Your avoidance makes more sense now, she continued. But my seeking you out was driven by discomfort too. I needed to understand why you wouldn't embrace the simplified story we're both taught. And my avoidance was cowardice, Nathan admitted. Easier to keep distance than confront complicated feelings about species that saved mine, while also letting hundreds of millions die in process. So where do we go from here? Liara asked. Nathan considered. Maybe we stop pretending it was simple, start being honest about cost of hesitation, reality of intervention philosophy, complexity of what happened. Maybe we both carry the shame, yours for waiting too long, mine for creating crisis that required intervention, and try to do better going forward. Partnership built on honest reckoning rather than comfortable myths, Liara summarized. They began collaborating on joint historical project, documenting the intervention from both perspectives, including Velastri debates about timing and human warnings that were ignored. Lives that could have been saved with earlier action and changes that happened because humans were forced to confront self-destructive patterns. When they presented findings to mixed audiences, reactions were intense. Some angry at learning Velastri deliberately waited, some defensive about intervention philosophy being questioned, but others, particularly younger members of both species, grateful for honest reckoning. The project became foundation for new approach to intervention philosophy, not abandoning principles, but acknowledging that waiting for optimal timing has real costs that must be weighed against developmental autonomy concerns. Human education began including more complete version, acknowledging Velastri aid while examining human failures that made intervention necessary and Velastri hesitation that increased death toll. Nathan and Liara developed genuine friendship built not on comfortable myths but shared commitment to honest history. Still carrying shame, his for humanity's self-destructive period, hers for her people's hesitation, but carrying it together made it bearable. Years later, when younger humans asked Nathan why he spent so long avoiding Velastri, he told them about shame he carried and how confronting it required acknowledging both species failed. Humans in creating crisis, Velastri in hesitating to prevent unnecessary deaths. And when younger Velastri asked Liara why she challenged Nathan's avoidance, she told them comfortable lies create comfortable relationships, but honest reckoning creates genuine partnership. We could have continued pretending, she explained. But that would have meant teaching our people simplified versions, making my species unqualified heroes and his species grateful failures, when reality is we both made choices that cost hundreds of millions of lives. Being willing to face uncomfortable truth together allowed us to move forward as genuine partners rather than actors in mythology. Nathan added, "The intervention saved billions, that's real. But it also came too late for hundreds of millions who could have been saved. Both things are true. Both failures contributed to the death toll. Acknowledging that complexity is painful. But it's the only way to ensure we don't repeat those failures going forward." Their honest reckoning didn't erase shame either carried, but it transformed it from isolating burden into shared understanding that made both species more thoughtful about intervention philosophy, more honest about historical failures, and more committed to genuine partnership built on truth. Because sometimes the most important conversations challenge the stories we tell ourselves, and sometimes being willing to be